All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to HCC's celebration of Constitutional Day. Can I get a little round of applause, please? Woo! So, in honor of our celebration, we are going to be having three very esteemed and knowledgeable professors talking about the Constitution, more specifically, the Supreme Court. Now, first, we're going to have Professor Rykowski, and she's going to be talking about the history of the Supreme Court. After her, we're going to have Professor Kramer, and he's going to be talking about common trends in the Constitution, as well as judicial review. And then after him, we're going to be having Professor Eric Schwartz, and he will be talking about controversies surrounding the Supreme Court. All right, does that sound pretty good to everyone? All right. I will say, if you do like what you hear here, feel free to reach out to Professor Schwartz or me if you are interested in joining the Political Science Club. We meet every Thursdays, 2:30 to 3, right here in the Student Center. So if this is something you're interested in, feel free to show a little bit of interest. So without further ado, let's get it on a roll.
All right, thank you so much, Ellie. I certainly appreciate not only the wonderful introduction, but the opportunity to reprise our role from last year and join my colleagues in this celebration, and now an exploration of the Supreme Court and the power that it has yielded in the past and yields now. I do have to say that in talks and preparation for this, those of you who know me and those of you who may not, brevity is not my strong suit, but I will yield to the deference I have from my colleagues and want to leave plenty of time for discussion today. So I will be limited to 10 minutes, and again, you know what a stretch that is for me, but at the same time, I am really excited to share some of this information with you. So when we get to the power of the Supreme Court, I want to frame this in historic terms, and that's why I've titled my brief 10 minutes, From Paltry to Powerful, a brief history of the Supreme Court's meteoric rise to prominence. So starting off with a rhetorical question for you all to be thinking about in this moment. How influential do you consider the Supreme Court of the United States? Just think about it for a moment, whether personally, socially, nationally, how important is the Supreme Court of the United States? Hopefully, all of you, if not many of you, are thinking, yeah, really powerful, really influential. We see the way in which the court has shaped our society and politics, and vice versa, the way our society and politics has shaped the court. But would you be interested to know, from a historical standpoint, the conception of judicial, even supreme power is the result, or as a political strategy, is a result of the expansion of the institutional might of the federal court system since its inception in 1789 as a separate system of balance and power. But much like the Constitution itself, it got off to a very dubious start. So much so that in the formation of the Constitution, in Article 3 that defines the Supreme Court, it represented really little more than a small peripheral check on the balances of power of the legislative and executive branch. That there was a guiding belief during the formation of the Constitution that it was just going to be a peripheral check on the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches. That even in the arguments for the Constitution's ratification, Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers number 78, goes on to say that don't worry about the power of the court. You know, we're really going to concentrate on the branches that have the purse, right? That is Congress, the legislative branch, and the sword, and that is the executive branch. We're not going to worry too much about the judicial branch. So when we see the court allotted its space in this balance of power, it really was relegated to almost a second-class role. It was not looked upon terribly favorably. Some were concerned about it, but for the most part, nobody was really going to demand a lot of time and attention be put into its formation. So then we see, once the Constitution is ratified a little bit later on, that even still, you can see some of the images. We're having issues with technology here, but you can see some of the images down there. The first meeting spaces, right? Almost a glorified barn. Oh, now we have no images, but that's okay. We're going to say the spirit of Alexander Hamilton is alive and well. He is trying to tell us that we don't need to worry about the Supreme Court. Again, it is not going to handle the purse or the sword, and we're just going to leave it in very ambiguous terms. And so we see that even when the capital gets moved to Washington, D.C. in 1800, they don't even afford space for the Supreme Court to meet. So, right, very auspicious and very dubious beginnings when it comes to the presence and the role that the Supreme Court and even the federal judiciary are going to play in the foundation of the United States and the execution of the Constitution. And so much so, I've got some quotes down there that even my vision's not that great, I can't really see, but basically paraphrasing observers who were wandering around the Capitol looking for these different heads of the branches. I was saying you could wander, oh, there we go, yeah, that you could, a stranger being able to traverse the dark avenues of the Capitol for a week, without finding a remote corner, which justice is administered to the American Republic, right? They didn't even have space to meet. Because again, Alexander Hamilton and his contemporaries all said, this is the least dangerous branch. We're not going to afford it a lot of attention. So you can see now in those images, some of the first meeting spaces, right? Relatively paltry and really fairly unaccommodating to the supreme system of justice in what had become the United States. And you can see even in the caption, over the course of the first 10 years of the Supreme Court, they only heard 9 cases overall, so much so that one of the justices, James Williams, actually was moonlighting as a Supreme Court justice. His main job was a professor at the Philadelphia College. So, right, not a lot of power and prestige happening in these early halls of justice. So what changes, right? It was relatively and ambiguously defined in Article 3 that they would be lifetime appointments and they would have the final say, but that was really about it. So very elastic and flexible terms. So what then is concluded by scholar Julius Goebel is saying, well, the framers in the Constitution had crayoned in the outlines, but it was going to leave Congress up to fill and color the canvas, right? So it is going to be Congress and even the people who are informing and influencing Congress that are going to define the power and prestige of the Supreme Court. So we start to see a more meteoric rise from these paltry beginnings, right? Kind of second-class institution in the branches of government with the empowerment of the Judiciary Act of 1789. Again, only have 10 minutes. In essence, what this does is create the lower systems of federal court. So thus then empowering the Supreme Court as the ultimate say in the supreme law of the land, right? Still relatively undefined and relatively untested. And in the last slide too, you may have noticed one of the images as well, they only determined one case after their first session, right? So they're not very active, they're not really very involved in the foundation of the United States at this point. And they even sought to solidify the first justices, the first Supreme Court Justice John Jay and his contemporaries sought to solidify the judicial branch as an independent, non-political, non-partisan branch of government. In fact, George Washington, having been good friends and having been through this revolutionary experience with his friend John Jay and the formation of the Constitution, kept asking for advice, and John Jay said, no, I'm staying out of this. We can talk as bros kind of privately offhand, but I am not going to give you advice on the legalities of some of the things that you're doing. We want the two to be separate. We don't want it to be necessarily political. This does start to change, however, when the Supreme Court and the justices do take a foray into what become necessarily political actions. So with the Whiskey Rebellion and George Washington and Alexander Hamilton personally riding out to suppress a rebellion against taxes in Western Pennsylvania using the existing Riot Act of 1792, this goes to the Supreme Court and says, can they do this? Can the president use the militia to suppress a rebellion against his own folks? The Supreme Court does agree that he does, in fact, have the right to invoke the Riot Act and the Militia Acts to suppress rebellion. We also see the Supreme Court start to weigh in during the Adams administration after the issuance of the Alien and Sedition Acts, particularly the Sedition Act, where John Adams was having folks jailed who dissented and disagreed with his form of government. Now, the Supreme Court did not ultimately publish an opinion that there had been a change in administration with the election of Thomas Jefferson, but even with the Whiskey Rebellion and the Alien and Sedition Acts, we see that the Supreme Court is now stepping in to tackle some of these thorny issues of both public and political interest. So here we go, the meteoric rise and the gradual empowerment of the Supreme Court as being equal, perhaps more influential branch of government, because what they had did by stepping in is lowered the flag and ignited a race to balance now this power, the politics, and the institutional decisions from all branches of government. So in this pathway, they would both shape and reshape the nation. So we see this gradual but yet meteoric rise in power. What really flips the script is a monumental decision in 1803. We now have Chief Justice John Marshall. Over his illustrious 34-year career, he becomes part of over 1,000 decisions and has approximately 500 published opinions, right? They only got through 9 cases in the first 10 years. This gentleman oversees a massive amount of work in his over 3 decades of service. But what, again, really flips the script is a monumental case of Marbury v. Madison. It is the true game changer, not only in the meteoric rise, but a moment of empowerment of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. The basic essence of the question that James Marshall, or John Marshall and his contemporaries were grappling with was an act of Congress or the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. The outcome of this is such a game changer because the ultimate conclusion by John Marshall was that that Judiciary Act of 1789 in and of itself was unconstitutional because it had bestowed upon the powers of the court powers the Constitution explicitly forbid. So he not only overturns the Judiciary Act, but goes forward to declare a practice of judicial review, that yes, it was up to the Supreme Court and even the federal courts to hold the power to declare legislative and executive acts unconstitutional. This is massive, right? This really changes the game in allowing the Supreme Court to step in now into the social and political spheres of influence. So this is the way in which we see the institution has now been able to be defined and redefined, both by society and politics, and vice versa, the way the court's power can shape and direct politics and society, and thus leading us into ages of questions of judicial activism, judicial restraint, judicial progressivism, originalism, all these hot button items that didn't exist until John Jay and John Marshall. So this is where we see, other than subsequent landmark decisions, that define the power of the court and the nation, and even the power of the people, right? Those of us here in the United States. Now, there's not gonna be a quiz, you don't have to memorize all of these, but just taking a sampling of the sundry of cases that have shaped and reshaped the nation and our lives, including McCullough versus versus Maryland, issues of states' rights, Gibbons v. Ogden, interstate, allowing the federal government to oversee interstate commerce, Warsher v. Georgia. We're seeing individual and indigenous tribal communities' rights at stake. Dred Scott v. Sanford, monumental decision regarding the role of slavery and citizenship. Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad. For those of you who are in my 202, this is where they use the 14th Amendment to protect large corporations as private individuals. They give personal entities to private corporations. Plessy v. Ferguson establishes the rule of separate but equal, legalizing and nationalizing segregation. Brown v. Board of Education, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. Of course, hopefully nobody in this room is familiar with the outcome of Miranda v. Arizona, but the rights that you have during an arrest. And then, of course, we know some of our very hot button topics and current controversies that we face now. The establishment of Roe v. Wade, Obergefell v. Hodges for LGBTQ rights, and then the overturning, right, where we currently are, Dobbs v. Jackson. So again, small sampling, but showing just how powerful this institution has become, despite, right, look at those images from the first meeting place to the Supreme Court as we recognize it now. So it's also come to reflect the political and social civil influences on the court, and vice versa, the way in which the court influences social, civil, and political movements. So as you can see, and as my colleagues will be attesting to in just a few moments, they remain fluid and fluctuating as well, right? These are moments at which we can continue to define the court, and the court will continue to define us. And in the end, all of this fluid and all of these fluctuating moments continue to define history in action. Hopefully I got in under 10 minutes. I'll yield the floor to my next colleague, the illustrious Professor Andy Kramer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Speaking fast is usually not a problem for me, so I'll try to get it done in maybe even less than 10 minutes. So what I wanted to talk about today was some of the issues, trends, and the function of the Constitution in general as we celebrate this wonderful document today, and sort of give you an idea about what is the Constitution, what isn't, and what some of the issues and trends are, the patterns in judicial review, or the manner in which the court actually reviews cases. So just a little bit of a test for you guys. It's the same thing I give my students. I'll read it very quickly. You tell me if the Constitution is invoked in this fact pattern. You've just endured a grueling and angry divorce from your ex-husband, who is a U.S. citizen of Asian descent. With the divorce settlement, you decide to open a restaurant in downtown Hagerstown. However, because of your mistrust and ill feelings and anxiety after the divorce, you have decided to create a safe environment in your restaurant, so you hang a sign in the restaurant that says, "No Asian men allowed." Now, Mr. Lee, a U.S. citizen of Chinese descent and new to town, is taking a walk and seeing your restaurant, decides to go in and get a bite to eat. You confront him as he enters the store, as the restaurant, and you tell him to read the sign. Mr. Lee walks away, disgruntled, and visits the hot dog stand, which is down the street, which is actually a pretty good place on the corner of Antietam and Potomac, if you've been there. Later, you are served with a summons to appear in court to defend his lawsuit against what he alleges is a violation of his constitutional rights. Does he have a case against you? Well, what do you think the answer is? Of course, if this were in class, I would actually wait here until someone raised their hand and said yes or no. But the reality is, no, he does not have a case against you. Now, why? What's the reason why he doesn't have a case against violation of his constitutional rights? And that is because the function of the Constitution is to protect us not from each other, but from oppressive government. It is a document that we sent our elected representatives to Washington to monitor themselves, to make sure that they never violated our rights. So just a couple quick checks. What principle guides the function of the U.S. Constitution? Well, what we've just been talking about is the idea of state action. And state action means that the Constitution protects me from government. It's a roadmap for government. It's not a roadmap for how we treat each other. And that's a really important distinction. Does anybody know what is the roadmap that discusses how we should treat each other? There is a body of law, an origin of law out there that tells us these are the things you can and can't do to each other. Not the government, but that we can do to each other. Well, those are called statutes. And those come from legislative bodies, in our case, the Congress, when we talk about federal stuff. Can a state's constitution give more protection to citizens than the U.S. Constitution does? The answer is absolutely. Remember, the federal government gives, and the Constitution from the federal side, gives us minimum protections. If Maryland, for example, and it does, wants to give us more protections than the U.S. Constitution, by golly, it certainly can, and it does, right? Can I raise a federal constitutional challenge to a state law? Well, of course I can. I absolutely can, and it's done every day. Normally there's a process, and the Supreme Court doesn't handle every case that comes before it. It decides what cases to hear through this process known as certiorari, which is a very complex process, and maybe one of the controversies that Professor Schwartz will talk about, and that is who decides what the Supreme Court will hear, and that is the Supreme Court itself. There are no mandatory appeals by the Supreme Court. I wanted to read a little bit to you from the Maryland State Constitution. And the Maryland State Constitution has some very interesting language. So let me read it to you. And the language says, after further recognizing the natural tendency of civil government to exceed beyond the limits of its rightful charter and usurp authority. What does the word usurp mean? It means to take without authority, right? And power, which have been authorized to it by God or delegated to it by the consent of the governed, it is the duty of the people. Now listen to this part. It is the duty of the people through the agency of the lesser magistrate, et cetera, to challenge the civil government. According to the Maryland Constitution, if government exceeds its responsibilities and its duties to us under the Constitution of the state, we have a duty to revolt, to engage in civil unrest. I mean, that's why I think the Constitution, the concept of Constitution is so important, because it really tells the government what it can and can't do. All right, the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. First of all, let's talk about what the Fifth Amendment, what I tell my students is the Mac Daddy provision of the Fifth Amendment, and that's due process. Due process is our right to be heard, our right to procedural fairness when the government wants to take away from us one of three things. What are those three things? Well, it says it right there. Life, liberty, or property. Now, the interesting thing about the Fifth Amendment, which is the fifth part of the Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment only applied to federal cases. It didn't apply to state cases. So how did the Fifth Amendment get applicable, for example, to Maryland, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, California, North Dakota? It was the process through of what we call incorporation, which was in the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the first time that the Constitution actually says, you know what, all these provisions that the federal government has to give its people, now the state governments have to give as well. And that process is referred to as incorporation. And I'll show you a little picture. This is the first thing that actually limited the power of state governments, not just the federal government, but state governments as well. And that's through the 14th Amendment. If you can see this diagram that I put up, I thought it was really interesting because what it shows is the sponge, the hand of the Supreme Court holding a sponge. And what that sponge is doing is sort of sopping up all the rights in the Bill of Rights and then wringing the sponge out over the individual states. And that process, the process of incorporation, is what the Supreme Court has decided to do in individual cases, telling us this amendment gets incorporated through the 14th Amendment. This amendment gets incorporated through the 14th Amendment. On and on and on, all through the Bill of Rights. Now, question is, there's three general views on incorporation. I'm not going to take you through all of them, but I will tell you which is the most common view for how the Supreme Court determines which Bill of Rights get picked up by the sponge of the 14th Amendment and wrung out and sopped out and sort of dropped out onto the states. And that is the idea of selective incorporation. Important to understand because selective incorporation incorporates the idea that fundamental rights that are incorporated in the Bill of Rights, they get picked up by that sponge and wrung out onto the states through the 14th Amendment concept of incorporation. What are fundamental rights? That's an interesting question. And the Supreme Court talks about that, and talks about it in a couple of cases that Professor Rakowski talked about, which we'll get to in just a minute. How am I moving? Is that fast enough? I think it's too fast for me. I'm tired. All right. Selective incorporation. Now, I talked a little bit about, I mentioned I would talk a little bit about trends. This is a big deal. I'll do it as quickly as I can. What's the difference between judicial restraint and judicial activism? So, by the way, I'm racing through this. If you have questions or you'd like to see some of these slides, come talk to me. This is not an appropriate environment to talk about this stuff. But what is restraint? Restraint is the idea that certain justices tend to adhere to. And I've given a picture of two of them down there. Well, one of them, Justice Scalia, Antonin Scalia, who was sort of the hero of judicial restraint, standing by his really good friend, Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They were on completely the opposite side of the fence, but it turns out in real life they were very close friends, and they actually spent a lot of time together. But when we talk about restraint and the idea of textualist or originalist, I want to make it as simple as I can, and that's the idea that the Supreme Court, in reviewing cases, in the idea of judicial review, which Professor Rakowski introduced, have an idea that the Constitution should always be interpreted in what has come to be known as its plain meaning. Now, what does that mean? It means that whatever words, and we use textualism to figure out what the words mean, and that is that it's important for my generation, for people 100 years ago, now, and people who are yet to be born and people who will be born 200 years from now, that the Constitution have a plain meaning, and that is that it can't constantly change. It has to be something that we can rely upon. Otherwise, without a constitution, there is no government. So this is the basic underlying principle of restraint. Now, in terms of the way that the court reviews this thing, generally speaking, it doesn't in restraint, who that Scalia was sort of was the Mac Daddy of. In restraint, we generally speaking, we don't make policy. We only deal with the question at bar. We don't answer larger questions, right? So we talk about the Constitution in its plain meaning and what that document needs to be relevant now, yesterday, and tomorrow. Now, activism. Activism has many supporters and is a legitimate argument as well. And what the activist court does, and I think there's an argument that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was among those who subscribed to the activist view, and that is we're not just going to interpret the Constitution, but we are going to establish new policy. We're going to create policy that should be made the law of the land. Now, the activist butts heads with the restraint guy who says, wait a minute, we're judges, we're not policymakers. Who makes policy? The legislature makes policy. We only interpret the policy to determine its constitutionality. So this is, in a nutshell, right, the difference between activism and restraint. The thing that motivates activists on the court is this concept that the Constitution must be a living document. And if you take any of my courses or any of Professor Schwartz's courses, I'm sure this is a phrase that is very important, near and dear to everybody's heart. There is certain truth to this. But when we create a living document, are we somehow running afoul of the idea of plain meaning and that the Constitution must have a permanent meaning now, tomorrow, and in the future? So these are the arguments that are made when we talk about the trends. Now, whose law do we have to follow? And I'll go through this. I'm almost done here. I thought class was hard. This was even harder. I'm moving so fast. The 10th Amendment. Little known 10th Amendment. What does this mean? I'm going to read it to you. It's very few words. Most of the amendments are very few words. 4th Amendment, which I deal with all the time, only has 54 words in it. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does that mean in English? Well, this is me as the federal government talking to the states. And what it means in English is, if it ain't ours and we didn't tell you that you can't do it, it belongs to you, the states. That means that if we didn't reserve it for ourselves and we didn't tell you in some document or treaty or whatever that the states can't legislate on this, you can legislate on it, it's up to you. The issue of legal cannabis is an interesting issue and would have been under Trump had Jeff Sessions stayed the Attorney General, another story for another day. Let's talk a little bit about some of the examples. And these are cases that I'm sure you've heard of, and Professor Rakowski talked about them very briefly. Judicial restraint. What are the problems with it? One of the problems with judicial restraint is when technology comes along, If it's not in the plain meaning of the Constitution, how do the justices of the Supreme Court deal with it? And I think one of the answers to that is that, at least the answer that restraint advocates give, is that we as restraintists can interpret the Constitution, but we can't create. We can't create policy. We can interpret the words through textualism to determine what it means. That's the argument on both sides. Judicial activism. Should the court extend the Constitution to create brand new policies to accommodate changing values? The argument for that is obvious, that society changes, so should the law. Well, we talk about this in paralegal studies all the time. The question is there an argument against it? And that is, what happens if society changes back again? What do we do in a constantly changing society? Is it possible that activism can leave us without certainty and without predictability? These are the two arguments that we talk about. And then finally, a couple cases, and I'll cover them very briefly, and then I'm done. Roe v. Wade, we all knew about. Hodges versus Obergefell. These are cases in which the court was somewhat activist in that it created a policy that it placed into law. Now, Hodges versus Obergefell means that said that no state can interfere with a person's right to enter into a civil union on the basis of sexual preference or gender orientation. So that means that gays can marry, and no state can stop them. That was a policy. That was a result of social activism. Now, I'm not saying it's bad just because of that, but that is an example of changing the law to accommodate society. Now, then we have the Dobbs case, and I'm just going to talk about that very briefly, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. What did the court do? If you look at the 10th Amendment, go back to that, the court said, if it ain't ours and we didn't tell you that you can't do it, it's yours to legislate. All the Supreme Court did in Dobbs, although it's unpopular, as a policy decision, it's unpopular, all the Dobbs case did was say, you know what? We can't articulate, we can't find anywhere in the Constitution where a woman's right to choose to have an abortion in the first 3 months of her pregnancy is a right. Therefore, under the 10th Amendment, where does it go? It goes to the states. And that's exactly where it is now. Good and bad. Some states had what they called triggering provisions. Maryland triggered. As soon as Dobbs was decided, what did Maryland decide as a trigger provision? That abortion would be legal. What did Mississippi decide as a trigger provision? Abortion would be illegal. So now you have people from Mississippi who want to get an abortion who can't, who will come to Maryland or go to California. These are the sort of issues and the repercussions of this, the differences between activism and restraint. Resolvable today? Potentially. Problems that we'll continue to have looking forward in the future of the Supreme Court? Absolutely. And that's all I have to say about that, as Forrest Gump said.
Thank you, Professor Kramer. Thank you, Professor Rukowski, and thank you all for coming out to talk and listen about some information about the Supreme Court. Happy Constitution Day. It was actually yesterday. We're celebrating a day late. I'm talking about the Supreme Court from a slightly different angle. I teach political science, so this is sort of the more current political angle. I have a graph up there that shows current estimation, current popularity of the Supreme Court. The poll was done by Pew Research, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institution, very reputable, to put it mildly. You'll notice the popularity of the Supreme Court at this point, the unpopularity is 54%. In other words, majority of the public do not favor currently the Supreme Court as it stands. You notice sort of the outlines out, we have sort of an hourglass figure, but this is the first time that the Supreme Court has reached this level of unpopularity. And you might ask, well, why is that? So we're going to look at some of those reasons. One explanation, you might say, well, it's partisan sour grapes. We have 3 justices that were appointed by President Trump. The most justices appointed in a term since actually Reagan. Reagan, he had 2 terms. So, and you'll notice there's the red and blue lines there, and you can see the plummeting favorability of the court with the blue line and the people registered as or favoring Democrats at pretty low level. So you could say, well, is it just a partisan issue? And that might be part of it. You have, three, as I said, 3 justices appointed in close succession there. And also, it could also be a result of controversial decisions. As Professor Kramer said, noted that we have probably the most prominent unpopular decision or controversial decision is Dobbs' decision, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Huge impact across the country. We have, just in the first 3 months after that decision, more than 60 clinics in 15 states being shut down. So huge impact on women's lives across the country as the individual states have the authority to ban abortion, and many do. And again, generally Republican led states. So we have a partisan aspect to this. On the right, Dobbs, of course, is hailed as protecting the life of fetuses. So you have that aspect, and that, of course, there are very large socioeconomic and racial elements in the Dobbs decision. So that because the effect of the decision does not fall equally across all in society, many people in, for example, Texas or whatever, are totally shut off from abortion rights because if they are, poor. So this is affecting poor minority groups disproportionately. So it's controversial. There are a string of other controversial decisions in the last couple of years. Striking down affirmative action, ruling for a Christian web designer, turning away business from gay clients, striking down plan to forgive student loans, student debt, shooting just most recently, shooting down a plan to protect the nation's wetlands. These are controversial decisions. So you might say, well, that might be one reason why there's this plunging estimation of the Supreme Court. There are also ethics issues that have come to light, particularly in the last year. And this is a broad issue. I want to point out, it's not limited to 1 or 2 Supreme Court justices. The Supreme Court does have certain ethical guidelines that are supposed to be in place, and yet there is at least there's clearly evidence that these guidelines have not been followed. Probably the most prominent offender in this regard is Justice Clarence Thomas, who has received a lot of money from various sources of plaintiffs. People have later been plaintiffs before the court, or plaintiffs or defendants before the court. And he has not disclosed that. So this is, the information about these cases came out because of independent reporting, investigative reporting. And he has basically, explained himself by saying he, at the time, was told that he didn't have to disclose this information. So there's also Justice Samuel Alito, who has been, again, documented to receive a considerable amount of money from particularly this one hedge fund billionaire, did not declare any of this, and has also refused to recuse himself from cases where he has been involved with one of the parties before the Supreme Court. But I do want to point out that there it goes. There are these, Alito and Thomas are not the only justices who have these issues. I mean, not particularly these issues, but the other ethical issues have been raised with other justices. The court right now is dominated by a conservative majority, but these justices are liberal and conservative. Sonia Sotomayor is in the liberal category. Barrett, Gorsuch are in the conservative majority. Breyer is no longer on the court. Kagan is in the liberal minority. Ketanji Brown Jackson, likewise. So these ethical concerns apply both to left and right. As I said, the most prominent characters involved are on the Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, are probably the most prominent justices involved, but it is not exclusive to them, right? There have been political initiatives to address this issue. There's legislation that has been put forth coming out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's probably not going to go anywhere. It's being opposed by Republicans in the Senate, so it's not likely to pass, but this is being talked about in the Senate, not so much in the House. Another issue, I'm going to try and do this briefly, that this is the issue you might not have heard of. It seems a little obscure, but which is kind of a shame because it has a huge impact. It's sort of colloquially called the shadow docket. And so the cases that, Professor Rakowski and Professor Kramer are talking about are sort of or what is generally known as the merits docket, right? So that's, Dobbs and Roe v. Wade and those type of high-profile cases. Those are argued. You can read the transcripts of the argument, et cetera, et cetera. The shadow docket it's called shadow docket because it's not transparent. It sort of happens in the shadows, right? But actually, that is the majority of court action at this point. And those are the decisions that are not publicized, but they have a huge impact about what goes forward and what doesn't. And for example, most recently, there were decisions made by this court to basically freeze an order that would have overturned the district maps in Alabama, basically to do away with a racial gerrymandering situation. The Supreme Court essentially overturned that lower court document, but there was very little publicity about that. And there is no transparency about it. Like, who's making these decisions? What is the reasoning? That is not provided to the public. So many court watchers said this is a problem, and it has happened. Right now, it's about happening twice as often as it used to. It's increasingly important as far as what the court is doing, and we don't have a window into it. It's not transparent. So all of this affects the respect of the Supreme Court, and as I started out, you see this overall respect of the Supreme Court plummeting in the American public. Why does that matter? Why does it matter if you're popular or not? Well, as Professor Rakowski pointed out, the Supreme Court doesn't have its own police force. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have an enforcement. It depends on the executive branch to enforce the law. And it also, it depends on respect for the institution and by extension, the rule of law. Our very democracy depends on the rule of law. And so if the respect for the Supreme Court is plummeting, that affects the respect for the rule of law. There are some initiatives that have been put forward to address this issue. The Congress is looking into establishing an ethics code. This is being strongly opposed by Chief Justice Roberts, but there are other justices. Justice Kavanaugh, for example, has said, well, we probably will do that. So it's uncertain where that's going to go. The Congress many constitutional scholars would agree that the Congress has the ability to shape what the Supreme Court does. There's nothing for example, there's nothing in the Constitution that says there are 9 justices. There's no statement that they have to serve life terms on the Supreme Court. It just says that they are subject to good behavior. There's nothing, so there are proposals, for example, to rotate people off the court and onto other federal courts. There's also this language could be used to restrain the use of the shadow docket. These are all various responses to the current situation. And finally, I have some information if any of you are interested about researching or looking into this for yourself. There are a couple sources. The American Bar Association, of course, you're probably familiar with. Fix a Court, you might not be familiar with. It's an advocacy group, nonpartisan, nonprofit, but looking at making changes to improve the functioning of the Supreme Court. And finally, scotusblog.com is one of my go-to sources about news about the Supreme Court. It's written by a blog that is written by lawyers, so it's extremely professionally produced. And I don't know how I did for time, but we have enough time for questions, comments, requests for more information. If you are interested, we have a microphone, or just raise your hand, and Peter, who will come and provide you with the means to ask your question. Please, I know I have students here, and you get extra credit, if not actual points. It will be looked upon favorably if you ask questions. And they also say, I know names. Any questions? Lorraine?
Everyone goes through an ethics course at some point in time during college, and all of a sudden you have all these ethics violations going on with the highest, the court in the land. And I'm wondering why it's taking so long to do something about it. We talk about it, we say, well, we could, but yet no action is taken, and these people just continue to line their pockets.
Anyone any of my fellow panelists want to respond to that? Why is it taking so long?
It was quick to overturn Roe versus Wade, but apparently they're having a problem with the money.
It's a very good question, Lorraine. I think that there's sometimes norms of behavior change, and sometimes there are certain norms about you might actually think also about the amount of money that is at play in politics, right? And the Supreme Court used to be kind of insulated from that. Maybe it's a matter of more money in politics, we're talking, billions of dollars, right? One of the people who was involved in the case with Alito subsequently had a case with Alito, and he had a payday of $2.5 billion. So that's a lot of money. So I don't have, other than that perhaps the ground has shifted politically and norms of behavior have shifted. Any?
I think one other issue is that as Professor Schwartz alluded to, any change to the Supreme Court has to be incorporated either as an amendment to the Constitution or as a federal statute. By law. The only way this can happen is if you have the ability of the House of Representatives and the ability of the House of Representatives and the Senate to agree on a particular legislative packet. And as you know, right now the Republicans have a slight majority in the House, and the Senate is pretty much even, but with a voting edge to the Vice President, who makes it sort of a Democratic majority. So I think what Professor Schwartz said, as well as the actual logistics of making a law that can actually impact ethics, that can change, I think it is going to happen. I think it will. But I think it takes time, because as Professor Schwartz indicated, a lot of it is politically oriented.
I also had a question. I was surprised to hear how a restaurant owner would be able to not allow a specific group of people. How is that constitutional to that group?
Yeah, had I had like 3 more minutes. Of course, the example I gave Is it a violation of Mr. Lee's constitutional rights? The answer is no. Does that mean that a private restaurant owner can keep out anyone from his restaurant on the basis of what we call a suspect class, which is race, socioeconomic class, gender, etc.? And the answer is, of course, no. But what authority tells the restaurant owner that? It's not the Constitution. The Constitution only protects us against oppressive government. So what protects us against oppressive individuals? That's the question. And the answer is something that LBJ did in 1964. You haven't got to that unit. Well, LBJ and even Kennedy before him was the founding father and the pioneer of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Statutes protect us from each other. The Constitution doesn't protect us from each other, it protects us from government. So that was the point I was trying to make. It's clearly not lawful to keep out anyone on the basis of their race, national origin, language, etc. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, mine's more of a, it seems to me that the 14th Amendment and the 10th Amendment kind of contradict each other. Saying that in the 10th Amendment that states have the rights to do what they want, basically. The rights are reserved to the states, but then it says in the 14th Amendment that they have no, they can't pass any laws that deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. And I guess my question is that in Roe v. Wade and the following Hobbes, it says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. How come they could overturn that? I mean, I understand statutes a little bit, but are statutes, I guess my question is, are statutes based on the Constitution?
Well, and I was going to say this goes back to exactly what Professor Kramer was talking about a little bit earlier in the determination of policy, right? That the Supreme Court is not responsible for creating that policy, or nor should they have the power for that. So they are upholding or attempting to interpret existing policy in very elastic and, as we know, constitutional terms and politically charged language, because then this goes back to the first question we were talking about, is the why and the how of appeasing the socio-political aspect of that. Because it's worth noting, there is an impeachment process for Supreme Court justices or the federal judiciary. But as we know, impeachment is necessarily political and has to be fomented by first the House and then convicted in the Senate. And so wrapping all of that together, then it becomes an issue of policy versus practice versus judicial interpretation. And that, I think, in so many ways is why we don't see a lot of action and why it can be so socially and politically consequential, because that's part of the conversation. So the justices as well as the politicians are watching this because of the lucrative paydays that are out there and available. So they're protecting themselves, I think, from the policies as much as anybody else. If anybody has a follow-up.
I think maybe another way, just to make sure I understand your question, your last question was, do federal statutes mimic or sort of imitate the Constitution? And I remember that statutes come from the people. I send my U.S. Senator or my representative from the House of Representatives to Washington to make a law on the basis of what I and my local community customs and traditions feel is something, I want him to fix the potholes, I want him to whatever. And from my state to the federal government, I've got 2 senators from the state of Maryland. They pass laws on the basis of the interests of their constituents. Now the question is, does this reflect the Constitution? It may not. And if it doesn't reflect the Constitution, then that statute goes up in the process that Professor Rakowski was talking about, that we refer to as judicial review, that under Marbury versus Madison, now there's precedent to say that the Supreme Court can say that the statute that was passed in Maryland to whatever is unconstitutional. So I think that statutes sort of reflect natural justice, but do federal statutes always reflect and imitate and adhere to the Constitution? No. I'll give you a good example. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, right, was a statute on the federal side that said that no civil police force in the United States could refuse the request of a slave owner to recover his escaped slave. Now, clearly, that seems like it doesn't reflect the spirit of the Constitution, and it lasted until it was overturned. So sometimes statutes and Constitution do run afoul, and that's the process of the Supreme Court, the duty of the Supreme Court, to turn those statutes around. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but...
The one thing I would add is that this is, I mean, it's a good question, and you point to the essential controversy, right? Because it can be, and it's not just statutes, right? Some of you remember the Affordable Care Act, right? The Affordable Care Act, it's not, that was a law, right? A law, and that was objected to by some parties, number of parties, that took it to the Supreme Court, right? And the Supreme Court decided some elements of that law were constitutional and some elements were not, right? So to your question about, is it the Constitution or the law ideally has to follow the Constitution, right? And ideally it is the Supreme Court that says, well, this falls within the Constitution or not. But that interpretation can change, and different intelligent people can have different opinions about it. That's why it ends up in court. Lorraine, you had
I'm interested in the interpretation. Since they can't create, they have to interpret. Do they all get together and have to put their I know it sounds a little ridiculous, but if you're not there, you don't understand it quite well. Do they all get a particular case and they all have to sit around, debate about it, and put their presentations in, and then they take a vote? How's that process done?
You want to take that?
And I was going to say, just, a quick history nerd moment. It was actually John Jay that set the precedent, and I will leave it to Professor Kramer for the Latin interpretation, that originally, yes, the Supreme Court justices determined separately, published them separately, but it was John Jay who committed to this idea of a collective voice. And even though we do still see majority opinions and dissenting opinions when there's a disagreement, that it was set early on within that first, under the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, who says we will speak as a collective voice. Even if we disagree, you will be afforded the opportunity to publish that dissent and articulate your dissension, but it will still be majority rule, and we will speak as one, even if, as we saw in Professor Schwartz's presentation, even if there's diametrical opposition and certainly very vast polarization of the politics, they're still speaking as one voice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and as Professor Schwartz was saying, I think that a lot of the procedures that happen behind the closed doors of the Supreme Court are somewhat arcane, and we really don't know. I can tell you that I think there is very little debate. There is very little few situations where you have 9 justices gathered around a table saying, how do you want to vote on this? I think that they have the opportunity to hear oral arguments and to question attorneys on the basis of the arguments. But then I think that they sort of retire back to their individual chambers, individual clerks, and I think they then write decisions. And then, as Professor Rakowski says, we start counting beans. How many votes do we have for this? Who concurs? Who dissents? So I'm not sure that it's a real, like a free-for-all kind of a dissent process where the justices get together and say, what do you think of that argument? What do you think? I think it's a little bit more individual than that.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I would just add on the resource page that unfortunately I didn't have a live link. Well, I do have a link, but I don't know how to do it. If you go to this scotusblog.com, one of the cool things, it has a calendar for the Supreme Court, and you'll see when are their arguments, when are their conferences, when are they actually doing these various things, and they're basically running October through May, sometimes into June. And so that's kind of what they're doing. And it does, part of it also varies, changes over time, changes by chief justices, run their courts in different ways, right? So we refer to this right now as the Roberts Court because by convention, name it by the Chief Justice at the time, right? And Chief Justices have different, you know, Chief Justice Roberts only has one vote, but he does have the authority to assign the, who's going to write the opinion. So there is that power. And sometimes you have cases where there might be, not that often, but you might have several dissenting opinions, separate dissents, right? Because people don't agree, but they want to make different points. Other questions?
I can tell you that in law school.
Yeah.
In law school, I hated those cases that had 25 dissents and 15 concurrent, because we had to read all of it and we had to brief every single decision. So I kind of like the ones where it's one, what we call per curiam, which is by the court. It's a single decision. So.
Yeah.
Faye, do you have a question? No, there's a stretch. Other questions? Okay. Oh, yeah.
I have a question I could Google. What's the salary of a Supreme Justice?
Offhand, I don't know, but I don't think it's too shabby. I don't. Over 200. Yeah, so not too shabby.
Not too shabby, huh?
Aim high. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I appreciate you all coming out this afternoon, and look forward to your write-up for my students. Yeah. And we'll see you next year for something.
Yes.